Welcome. This is the Free Market Roadshow, probably the largest annual series of public conferences on economics. Remarkable experts are discussing the challenges and providing libertarian solutions to today's problems. Organized by the Austrian Economic Center in cooperation with select institutes, universities and think tanks, the Free Market Roadshow tours all over Europe. Today we pay a visit to Rome.
Hello everybody, I am Giacomo Bandini and I serve as Director General at Competere, a pro-free market think tank based in Italy and Brussels. Here at Competere we want to understand the present in order to imagine and design a smarter future by developing policies and business models that foster innovation. By enhancing the public debate on what will be relevant issues, we aim to promote prosperity, increasing freedoms, and improving the coexistence of citizens. We rely on science and the experimental method to produce facts and pursue evidence that support smart and sustainable solutions for a broader open society. Competere is a place where citizens come to think, brainstorm, discuss, research, and also advocate for a smarter and freer world. Our doors are open to every individual and groups that wants to bring fresh ideas and visions. As an independent pro-free market think tank, we are so happy to be part of the Free Market Roadshow network and family, and to encourage discussion on the spirit of freedom and innovation that leads to progress and prosperity. If you would like to learn more about our activities, please reach out to us and visit our website, competere.eu. I hope to see you all soon.
And we are live, so hello everybody. Here we are today with a new Free Market Roadshow event. First of all, let me remind you that we are broadcasting live on the Free Market Roadshow official channels, and also that the webinar will be then re-uploaded on our social platforms in case you missed it, so you can watch it again and enjoy again our very interesting discussion. I will also remind to all of our audience who is following us right now that is also possible to make questions and comments to our great and excellent guests. So I will collect them all and actually I will transmit them and share them with our panelists. So with no further ado, let me illustrate briefly the topics that we are going to discuss today with our guest. The title of this live talk is From Social Animal to Digital Isolation, and which aims to be a discussion about current and future generation psychological issues and problems. We're going to discuss about the potential psychological problem that currently affects the young people and that may affect them, the future generation. Well, taking into consideration the changes happened in the last decades, such as massive digitalization that, of course, affected our life and affected the way that the young generation, the young people communicate, and also shape the way that messages and communication among them, and especially toward them, is happening and will happen, of course, in the future. But also we will take into consideration, we'll take into account the recent events such as the pandemic that certainly played a role in the development of problems and issues of the younger ones and may have highlighted their psychological issues. So let's proceed first with Keynote by Callum Nicholson, which will also be among our speakers today.
Hi, so today I've been asked to speak on the topic of, are we raising a generation of psychopaths? So I think this question is being raised because many people think that we are. And I think this itself is quite revealing, but perhaps for surprising reasons. So first of all, I think it's fair to say that one of the great achievements of the last decade, in Western culture at least, has been the mainstreaming of mental health as a subject of discussion and a general recognition of the importance of empathy. For a few years in the mid-2010s, this felt like something of a quiet revolution, a rounding out and maturing of the culture, adding a whole new dimension to how we understand and treat each other and indeed ourselves. And people began reading online magazines like Psychology Today, and you began to see op-ed pieces on mental health abound, and celebrities began to discuss their own mental health struggles. And I think to their great credit, the younger members of the British royal family became quite prominent mental health campaigners. And at the same time, new terms entered our collective lexicon. I began to hear previously obscure psychological terms like gaslighting pop up in ordinary conversations. Depression ceased to be a taboo subject. And suddenly far more people had a range of psychological diagnoses to hand and definitions memorized for ADHD, OCD, Asperger's and autism. And then, inevitably, in the end, the less sympathetic conditions such as borderline personality, narcissist, and psychopath. Now, at the time, all of this seemed great. Suddenly, we had a far more emotionally and psychologically literate society. No longer would depression be something one would have to hide or gloss over and keep silent about. No longer would being in therapy imply one was crazy. No longer would a kid in school be bullied by students and even teachers because they were socially awkward or couldn't focus. Knowledge would breed understanding and lead to a more empathetic society. And all this was a significant achievement, and probably the most positively transformative thing that has happened in Western culture this century. But as with every major shift in a prevailing culture, there's also been a downside, which has blown into view, I think, only in the last few years. And as with so much in the culture these days, this downside began to become apparent and quickly pronounced, I think, with the election of Donald Trump in 2016. His bizarre antics and statements inevitably led to a great deal of armchair diagnosing of his curious personality. He became a public study in narcissism and sociopathy and so on. And upon his election, and as has been widely reported, social media, previously a fairly benign place, blew up into a febrile and fractious space, and society found itself increasingly polarized as a consequence. One of the byproducts of the rising toxicity of social media and, by extension, the public sphere in the West has, in my view, been the sudden and frankly quite weird politicization and indeed weaponization of the language and lexicon of mental health. And I think this has happened in two different ways. First, to struggle with one's mental health is no longer understood only as a spectrum of human suffering. It's now also seen and communicated by many as an identity in and of itself, or even something positive. Greta Thunberg famously called being autistic her superpower. It is not simply that someone may struggle with ADHD or depression or autism. Many now define themselves by their diagnosis. Mental health has become, like so many other aspects of our lives, something performative. And as a consequence, the labels and categories of mental health have gained a certain utility and currency in the culture. Thus, we see people speaking as someone with autism or ADHD or depression and so on. When Thunberg declared her autism diagnosis, it also, of course, inoculated her, a public figure, against criticism, as any criticism was then easily framed as criticism of someone vulnerable. Similarly, many public figures and journalists have found that to frame themselves as a victim, especially with regard to their mental health, is an effective way to gain traction in the culture. People are praised for being brave or strong in talking publicly about their mental health. But in all this, there is a, I think, noticeable silence about understanding the causes and conditions of poor mental health. Often it seems that it is enough to simply declare something in public, almost as a form of rite or ritual. In other words, talk of mental health has gone beyond opening up a space in which people may be free from judgment to look to their well-being and to heal, and has entered a space where it has become performative, something that has a certain economic value. There are innumerable writers and public figures today who appear to have become, in a sense, professionally ill, who talk of nothing but their vulnerability or their victim status. As with so many other areas of capitalist culture, the incentives behind this are not purely about private healing, they're also about money. Second, where once the discussion of mental health was exclusively concerned with understanding and empathizing with others, this has now been joined by a concern for judging them too. I can't count the number of times I've heard someone refer to their ex as a narcissist or a psychopath or a borderline personality who was gaslighting them the whole time. Similarly, on almost a daily basis, I read or hear people say something to the effect that ex-politician is a narcissist who is gaslighting the nation. So all of a sudden, every bad experience is being described in quasi-medical terms as we seek to clinically diagnose a broken heart or wounded pride. And all of a sudden, every public eccentric or personality that isn't apparently generated by a focus group is being pathologized as a psychopath, a narcissist, or whatever it may be. And so this brings us back to the question, are we raising a generation of psychopaths? I would argue that no, we're not. But what we have done is generate a culture where our first reaction is to pathologize behavior we do not like, or perhaps do not understand, and to diagnose the people engaged in that behavior. Implied in calling someone a psychopath, or indeed any other label, is typically the drawing of a line between us and them, between the good and the bad, between the sane and the mad. This is what labels do. They don't explain why someone is the way they are, or why they do what they do, but instead simply state what they are, and usually draw attention to or assert that who they are or what they do is abnormal, beyond the pale, and usually ultimately their fault, or a moral failing. For all the talk of empathy that was characteristic of early discussions of mental health about a decade ago, the discussion now has all the hallmarks not of seeking to understand and embrace people, but to judge and discount them. And in saying this, I'm not arguing that people are acting normally or with empathy on the internet. I think the question, are we raising a generation of psychopaths, is in some ways actually a fair question, as we're certainly seeing an emergence of increasingly antisocial behavior, especially on social media, which of course bleeds out into the real world. In recent years, online bullying has skyrocketed, and there's been a general perception that social media, in recent years anyway, has become increasingly toxic. Whereas a few years ago, it was generally quite a polite and playful space, it's increasingly quite bad-tempered and combative, full of snark, and you increasingly see the use of bullying tactics in heated debates, including efforts to name, blame, and shame people for perceived thought crimes or insalubrious associations. And then, of course, since the pandemic began, the UK, at least, has seen a 32% rise in investment scams as people seek to protect their money or find alternative forms of income, and a 38% increase in online romance scandals as people seek out more online dating during the pandemic. And all this is indicative, I think, of the fact that con artists are out in force, taking cynical advantage of the credulous and the vulnerable more than perhaps they ever have before. But it's worth asking, is there another explanation for all these problems and the increase in antisocial behavior that does not require us to pathologize people, let alone young people? And I think that there is, and I think it's very simple. What if there is a pathology, but that is to be found in the system, not the people manipulated by it? Since the 1980s, we've lived in what has been termed a neoliberal economy. That is, an economy where the market is prized above all else, and the solution to every problem is seen as the removal of state regulation and barriers to a pure market logic. In this system, people are not ends in themselves or first and foremost citizens, but rather means to economic ends, and conceived primarily as consumers of goods. Additionally, this neoliberal period, which has since its beginning been highly data-driven, has had a close relationship with computing, which became commercially available, of course, at roughly the same time as neoliberal economic policies were adopted by Reagan and Thatcher. One could go so far as to say that computing is the technology of neoliberalism, and that neoliberalism is the economics of computing. The result, I think, has been a society that has been hollowed out, Today, the only value deemed meaningful is tangible, quantifiable, and especially economically quantifiable value. Thus, anything qualitative or intangible has been deemed not just of no value, but even completely meaningless. Thus, we have seen the closure of loss-making local and social services where their true value was really never something that could be expressed quantitatively, still less in direct and tangible economic terms. And we've also seen either the hollowing out of cultural institutions, such as the church, for instance, that were an end in themselves and which treated people as ends in themselves, or we've seen their transformation into profit-oriented businesses, as is the case with the popular American megachurches. At the same time, we've seen the transformation of brands and consumer items into quasi-religious symbols, or indeed priceless relics. So since the 1980s, sports stars have become idols via marketing and brands. Brands themselves have become identities like Nike or Apple. Product launch events have become harvest festivals of sorts, in which high priests of tech speak from raised stages, speaking indeed in the tongues of technology jargon, before rapt congregations of consumers, cheering and clapping. And things like sports cards of dead or retired sporting idols now sell for millions of dollars, like relics of old religions. And yet, these new forms of neoliberal consumerist meaning are hollow, because they are cynical and manipulative. And deep down, we all know it. If people are acting out this cynical logic, no longer able to see people as people, but just as consumers and customers, can you really blame them? They have been raised by a culture that does not prize culture unless that culture is generated by the neoliberal economy. And if people are angry in their efforts to reject that culture, and in doing look to either reject the establishment, as for instance Trump supporters did, or to reform the establishment, as the woke activists do, can we blame them? Both sides, which have more in common in their underlying concerns about the state of society than I think we generally care to admit, and certainly than they care to admit, are exhausted, I think, by 40 years of an economy that has treated them as means to ends, not ends in themselves, and that has been cynically manipulating them. So are we raising a generation of psychopaths? I don't think so. But even if we are, what made them that way? Either way, the real issue is not that people are psychologically pathological. It is that we live in a neoliberal system that is pathological for the human psyche. The culture may have recently given us the language and lexicon to diagnose and pathologize each other, but I think we do better to turn those tools in the system itself and diagnose the conditions within it that have left us as a society so psychologically fragile. Thank you very much.
So we just watched a very interesting keynote speech given by Callum Nicholson, one of our speakers. But first, let me introduce the first panelist, Mrs. Cinzia Niolu, who is an associate professor of psychiatry at the Tor Vergata University of Rome. I would like to welcome her to our event, and also I would like to ask her to give a comment on the speech, the video that we just watched.
And good evening, and thank you for your invitation. It's the first time I come here. I appreciate a lot the speech of Mr. Callum. And I noted something just to comment something about his speech. And one thing that he repeated many times during his speech is, is a question, are we raising a generation of psychopaths, or are we don't forget the boundaries between mental health and some kind of personality or character or some kind of vulnerability that we found in our population, both in adult people and also in adolescent and even in children. This is I think it's an important point, and maybe afterwards there is a space or some time for asking him some question. And I want to ask one thing: what he means about psychopaths. Does he mean psychopath in terms of psychopathy? And so the diagnosis of psychopathy, which is something very specific in our diagnostic system, and which is something having to do also with antisocial personality and usually some kind of behavior which brings to jail or to brings to some criminality. This is very important, and I go back to his first question, and also, are we raising something which is pathological? This is a very important question for us. I am an adult psychiatrist, but we are leading a lot of studies and a lot of cooperation with psychiatrists for children, for the developing age, because we found it's very important one phase of our developing psychological and neurological development also, which is the transition phase. We have one point between the end of childhood and the beginning of the early adolescence, which is called at times, different times, or window of vulnerability or window of opportunity. The two can go together also. What do we mean with windows? There is a time. Time is everything in our profession. Time is everything in our mental health. In this timing, if we see that something is going wrong, also if we have only some symptoms or some behavior that the teachers can notice at school, the school is very important because it's the first theater where the teacher can follow the children more than family, even more than family, because the children stay together with other children, and so they behave in some way, and they show maybe some kind of emotional imbalance or difficulty in communicate for each other, between each other, than one to another, and also something having to do with social isolation, which is another important point that we have to bear in mind for our talk. So what happens in this window of opportunity? We can do something really, but very important, most of all, we have to distinguish between what is health, what is character, what is the point of the neurodevelopment or the psychological development of the child, which maybe is having to do with the family, with the society, with a large family, or with the isolated family, because we know now in our societies, many times the family is formed by one or two people and one children, more often also one people and one children. So the sense of isolation is very important as a risk factor for mental health. In this period in particular, some years ago, we make a study in high school population, different kind of high school. There was classical one, scientific one, and also economic or commercial ones. And we found that about half of the school population, which was from 14 to 18, more or less, had a trend to a high risk for psychopathology. And when I mean psychopathology, I mean definite psychopathology, not only being sometimes, some days, a little blue, a little low mood, a little depressed, or a little finding our word changing in something that we cannot explicate, or also finding myself some kind of depersonalization or derealization, but something that is becoming stable every day, much part of the day, much part of the week, much part of the life of the child or adolescent. So this is something having to do with a possible pathway which is going to psychopathology, real psychopathology, where we can make a diagnosis, which is collecting a lot of symptoms, a number of symptoms lasting for some times, and interfering in some way with the everyday life, and especially with another concept that we have to put together with mental health, which is not only the absence of symptoms, but especially quality of life. Quality of life nowadays we put together with absence of symptoms or lowering of symptoms when we judge the effect, for example, of therapeutic intervention, maybe pharmacological ones or also psychotherapeutical ones, We don't only see the patient has no more delusions or is no more depressed, but we say the patient has no more delusions or less delusions or is better with his mood, but is also able to go to work, not being so tired, not having somatic symptoms, which very usual are the symptoms that stay for a long time and make us know that this is not going the right way, that the therapy has not made its work at all. So this is another thing that important. In this, going back to adolescence, we see that, of course, between 14 and 18, there is a lot of changing in the brain of the young boys and the young girls, and also in the body. So we have to take in account that sometimes we have some symptoms that come out with the body. Somatic complaints are very, very frequent in young people, and especially in after the pandemic, we saw a rise of somatic complaints, both from anxiety type and also from depressive type, affective symptoms anyway. And another thing is happening in the developing of the brain is the capability of staying together and to face what are the next challenges of life, because in these few years they face a lot of challenges that maybe for some one of them, which has maybe some psychiatric vulnerability coming from genetic. Now we speak about gene plus environment, and this is biopsychological point of view. We only think about this in mental health, not only in mental health, but especially in mental health. And there is one thing I have to say about using internet, that of course now after pandemic has become a very big problem, much bigger than before, because of course anyone can think that if a boy who is spend a lot of time with internet, and also, or maybe he's not addicted, but only spend a lot of time because he has a lot of friends on internet, but maybe few friends outside, or no friend outside, has to take his lesson on internet. You understand that his whole day is on internet. So sometimes they disconnect from school lesson and go on other sites of any kind, of course. But anyway, the end of this thing is they only talk with the computer. So it's not the computer. There was a very nice book I read some months ago, which is Internet Make Us Stupid. This is not true as a whole. We have to take in consideration that internet broadens our knowledge, but as for children, the danger is that they broadens without boundaries, and especially without the caring of an adult, which can choose or help the children choose what is better and what is not good. This is another important thing of the lack of the school, of the going to school in presence, because in presence, the presence of the teacher is something that guides the child and the children or the adolescents also in a learning pathway or an using of internet, which is good, which is just to broadening our information, to opening the boundaries of our brain and of our knowledge. But alone at home, if I have already a tendency to stay alone, not to empathize with other children, not to empathize also with adults in the house, that, for example, with the lockdown, they stay all together. There is a rising also of the domestic violence, and also with the assisted violence, which is the children which assist domestic violence. And this is always a traumatic event. Another thing that I want to say in respect also to Mr. Callum's speech is the concept of loneliness. I don't know if we are raising a psychopath generation, but sure we are raising, or we should stop raising lonely people. The concept of loneliness is something different from really being alone. It's not being alone only. It's being alone. Maybe loneliness, we can experience loneliness only being in the middle of the crowd, which is not what's happening these times, of course. But loneliness is the feeling, the subjective feeling of being isolated, being without nobody which talk with us, care about us, and with which I can share something. And this is a step, is a cornerstone for depression, is a pathway, is the first pathway for depressive and affective disorder, and with also sometimes we see also not only affective disorders, which is depression and anxiety, but also the so-called externalizing disorder, which sometimes in children is something that goes on the pathways of ADHD and also autism disorder. There is no time to speak about this, but you can imagine autism spectrum disorder in a lockdown and facing the isolation also of the family. So without any contact with the social supports and the health supports that they need to stay in balance. And sometimes many studies now, we see many children and many adolescents which have especially an emotional imbalance and irritability, and also some kind of violent behavior, unfortunately, mostly against themselves. So we see children that cut themselves, or children with very dangerous behavior, which are almost parasuicidal behavior, and also with rising suicidal ideation and also attempts. This has been rising in the first part of lockdown from March 2020. But I must also say that yes. So I conclude also that after I want to make a question to Mr. Callum, if it's possible. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Cinzia. Talking about boundaries, you gone a little bit too far with the time limit that we had for this first comment. So I will now introduce Mr. Callum Nicholson, who gave the keynote speech that we just watched before Cinzia's comment, and I would ask him to introduce himself to, and also to possibly stay within the 5 minutes. Maybe he could reply to what Cinzia said, commenting his keynote speech.
Hi, so of course I'm Callum Nicholson, and I teach part-time at the moment at Cambridge University. And I really appreciated Cynthia's comments, and I agree with what she's saying. And I'm reminded when she talks about loneliness of a quote from the actor Robin Williams, who obviously, as everyone knows, died of suicide a few years ago. And he was famous for saying that he used to think that loneliness was being alone, but actually loneliness is being around people who make you feel alone. And so loneliness is not necessarily about complete isolation, but not essentially being seen by other people and not being treated with empathy. And this really brings me, I suppose, to the answer to her question as to what I meant by psychopath. I was asked initially to talk on the issue of, are we raising a generation of psychopaths? But I think the term, as I understand it, was used essentially as a shorthand for really what we're seeing in society, which is the breakdown, or the perceived breakdown, of empathy across society. And I think that the context in which people are even asking this question is largely because we're seeing more of the world going online, and online in recent years we've seen far less empathy evident, and we're seeing far more intemperance on the internet. My essential point, though, is that I think the problems we're seeing in behavior, and the challenges people are facing in this digital age, and the breakdown of empathy that we're witnessing across society, is itself a symptom of a pathology. And the pathology, I think, is technological, that we have a lot of new technology. And as with every point in human history where a new form of communications technology has been put into place, we're seeing a great deal of societal rupture. So the same happened, obviously, with the printing press that led to the Reformations. The same happened with the invention of the radio. And indeed, a lot of the national socialist agendas in Europe in the 1920s and 30s were largely possible because of the brainwashing that happened through radio. The rise of consumerism happens on the back of television with the rise of advertising. And I think now the rise of social media is leading to a whole range of problems with how we communicate and how we relate to one another. And I think that the effect of technology on empathy is quite marked in really two ways. If you're looking purely at the family, on the one hand, you're seeing a lot of parents, for instance, no longer really engaging with their kids, not making eye contact, not fully present and paying attention. You often see parents, with the children, but they're on their phones because the phone is more interesting than the child. Or indeed, you're seeing a parent who's finding the child hard work, and so they just give them an iPad. Any of us who have young children or young nephews and nieces, in my case, we've seen them put in front of an iPad, and it's like a drug. It's like an opioid. They're addicted to it right away. And again, this breaks down the learning of empathy, the learning how to relate to one another. And I think one of the major problems we're facing there is that we're starting to substitute communication for connection. So we can communicate online in our narratives, but we can't connect relationally with people. And this, I think, is the crucial point for me, is that as human beings, we really always do two things. We narrate and we relate. So we tell stories, and we tell stories in the context of relationships. But increasingly, the online world is narratives that are detached from relationships. And so we're not actually meeting each other. It's very different for me to be talking here online with people in different countries and an audience I cannot see than if we were in the same room where we can make eye contact and I can see if you're enjoying the talk or so on. You can read the room. And when we're not having the relational part, it really changes how we interact. And I think if children are being getting used to, particularly in lockdown, only narrating but never relating, that I think will have a long-term impact on how their brain is wired. And I think ultimately, just to end, this really comes back to the point that Cinzia raised about quality of life, because to my mind, that we are relational animals. And I think that when we talk about mental health, I think often the term mental health is a bit misleading. For me, it's always been emotional health. It's not about mental disease, it's about emotional dis-ease and the symptoms of that. We've often, with the diagnosis, when we diagnose the spectrum of mental health disorders from depression and anxiety to other forms over the last few years, if you go back 30 years, the view was that it was physically caused, it was genetic, that it was a mental choice, that it was a weak moral fiber, is what the British military used to call it, weak moral fiber if you were depressed. In the last 15 or 20 years, there's been a shift to, instead of seeing it as a mental cause, to see it as a mental choice, to see it as a physical cause, it's genetic. I suspect it's really neither of these things. It's more about emotional conditions. It's to do with how we feel dependent on our relationships. The emotional is relational, and the relational is really where the empathy issue is. And because of the digital world detaching us from the relational, we are losing the empathy we learned through relationships. And this is leading, I think, to the epidemic of, as she said quite rightly, I think, of loneliness in the culture. And as you say, loneliness may not necessarily be that we are completely isolated from people, but that we are around people, but they do not see us. They are distracted by their devices, or simply they do not know how to interact with us anymore because we are losing the skills in the digital world of how to relate, because we are focused purely on how we narrate. And that's really would be my response. Thank you.
Thank you, Callum, for your response, for your comment, and also for answering the question that Mrs. Niolu asked you in her commentary session. Now let's move to our final panelist, Pietro Paganini, who is professor at Temple University of Philadelphia. Any comments, Pietro, on what you heard?
You see, I've been digitalized. I forgot to turn on my microphone. But I wanted to thank Giacomo, of course, for inviting me here at the Austrian Economic Center, Competere, for being here in Rome, and Professor Niolu and Colum. I can call him Professor Nicholson or Colum now. We've been chatting in different panels various times, so we can relate as names. It's such a brilliant discussion, and probably 5 minutes are not enough. We probably need a bunch of months or probably years to come up with some structure thinking around this fascinating and challenging issue. I had some notes that I put together before, but after the keynote speech by Colm and then Professor Niolu, and again the reply by Colin, that obviously has a strong British accent, and since I have a very bad Texan accent, it sort of puts. I probably need some sympathy from him. So talking about empathy and sympathy and lack of empathy. Let's start by saying before getting into the pandemic, let's say that if we, first of all, we are having a discussion that is very much limited so far, and that's my presumption, to the Western world. So to a very small group of people, that for us is a gigantic group of people, but if we compare it with the 7.6 billion of people that will tend to be 10 billion of people in the closer future, in the next 30 years, we're talking about a small portion of people. But it's a group of people that is living, let's say, in the future, and it's probably paving the path for the other billions of people. So in a way, it's very interesting that this minority, because we are a minority right now, the digital world is still a minority, despite it looks gigantic for us, but it's still a minority, is going through an incredible, or what we think is an incredible revolution, and probably as both Professor Niolu, Colum, myself, and most of the people that are following us, we belong to a generation that was born before the digitalization. So we have a certain analogic way of thinking. Meanwhile, if I look at my student, they have a digital way of thinking, and they have a very different way of relating to each other. So first of all, let me say, we probably need some data in terms of when we talk about psychopath, and when we talk about sympathy and empathy, how many are the people on this planet that are facing or experiencing empathy? And because I see also a lot of people that they have sympathy. But if we look at sympathy, what kind of sympathy and compassion are we talking about? And I'll come back to this later, because when I talk about sympathy and when I talk about compassion with my students, I see that that is very strong, very immediate, and it lasts a very short time, because society is based on short time. Media are based on short time. Social media are based on short time. But I want to go back for a moment. If we look at human beings, if we look at ourselves, the way we're structured, we evolved for the past 100,000 years by what other panelists have just said. We evolved in mobility. We were used to move a lot, move around for hunting, for picking. But we had to move around, and we were what we would say a mobile species, like most species. In order to survive, we had to migrate, and we had to move. And the pandemic actually has forced us inside our homes. So and technology is forcing us into our homes. The industrialization process has somehow forced us out of the countryside into factories. And so our relationship with the world around us has started to changing with the fact that we sort of stop our mobility. The second is what the other panelist said, is socialization. The fact that we are a social animal. As a matter of fact, we were used very much to meet together in a cave and then in a square. Look at the square I have behind me, meeting there and chatting. And when I was a kid, I was used to ride my bike and stop in the main square in my city nearby Milan and chat with people. I don't see kids anymore in squares, in the piazza. I don't see them anymore. They're home. They're home chatting. They're home doing many activities. And there are several studies, particularly in the United States, that they show how new generation, how kids have stopped playing. They go to school, they go to sport activities, they play the piano, they play music, they do structure activities, but they have stopped playing, as kids do. And this is an incredible challenge that we have. Kids are no longer playing, or if they do with video games in isolation. So this is the other element. The third element is that we were used to socialize in order to exchange knowledge. As a matter of fact, the information society is based on the sharing of knowledge. Right now, and the sharing of knowledge was based on a sort of discussion process, on a conflict process. And liberalism itself is based on this conflict through a discussion. If you go back to Socrates was used to discuss, and Plato tells us they were used to discuss in the agora. But now the agora is no longer there. The agora is on the internet. So information is now being shared through the internet. And I tell you, I have a hard time sharing information through the internet or through WhatsApp or through social media, but I see that this is what's happening right now. But again, here we have the element of time. Discussion on Twitter are happening. People are telling me we're sharing knowledge over Twitter. Are you really sharing knowledge through Twitter, or is it just knowledge for the moment that then disappears and is not adding anything to real knowledge? So we come to this point where the pandemic that we're experiencing right now has, in a way, made extreme of a process that Professor Nicholson Column has introduced earlier. The process through digitalization to stop moving mobility and isolating ourselves in a way, stop socializing and isolating ourselves. And the question is because of technology? Well, I would say it's not because of technology. Technology is a condition, is a variable. It depends on us. I always love telling this story, and I don't want to take too much of my time, but if we think about the printing process, the printing machine invented by Gutenberg, he was invented at the same time in China, but in China, it led to dictatorship still today. In Europe, it led to democracy, it led to free speech. Same technology, the printing press. So is the internet, social media determining this sociopathic attitude? I would say no. It's conditioning them, and in a way, it's up to us as human beings and the way we relate to technology to understand whether we could become sociopath. We could fall in that trap, or we can become, as I said earlier, sympathetic. But the question is, how do we measure this? And is this impacting? Professor Niolu was saying, is impacting on our labor, for instance, or our work? Is this limiting our capacity to live in a well-being? You talk about mental health. I would say more mental well-being. And how do we measure our mental well-being? And another element I would like to raise, and I'm not getting to any conclusion, is the element that, before the Industrial Revolution, let's call it Industrial Revolution, started in England, it came also here a few years later in Italy, in the rest of Europe, we were used, as I said, to move around, but we were not so much using our brain. Think about that. And I don't want to be offensive with people like Leonardo da Vinci or other geniuses around, but majority of people were using their body, their strength. Is with the Industrial Revolution that the majority of people, not the minority, the majority of people started basing their labor on our brain. As a matter of fact, we talk about, as I said earlier, the information society. And the information society is based on brain, less on our body. It's based on our brain. And all the recent studies in sociology, psychology, psychiatric are very recent, in the past century. So we have been here for 100,000 years, but basically we started studying our brain for the past 100 years. And we are finding incredible things. Probably Professor Niolu can confirm that we only know a small part of how our brain works and how our brain can do things. And because we are studying this, we're coming up with many solutions to our problems, but also with many excuses to our problems. And we're probably raising some issues because we know more about our brain. So when we talk about this attitude and behavior, it's simply because we're studying them. And before we didn't study them, and before we didn't even investigate them, because humans simply were, the majority of us were not using our brain, we were using our body, and so we didn't have really the time to be compassionate. Or think about a kid 400 years ago or 300 years ago, living in the countryside, living a miserable life, because most of them were living a miserable life and they didn't have time to think about their conditions. Today, we have time to think about our condition. So one element is probably we have too much time to think, and it's a good fact. But on the other side, the more we think, the more we dig into our brain, the more we come up with situations that make us potential sociopaths, but at the same time, they also make us more sympathetic.
Thank you, Pietro, for your comments. Actually, we have had a very long session of commentary of Callum's speech, so unfortunately, I think we won't have so much time for the panel discussion. But actually, we kind of had a panel discussion. So I will take next time that we have to maybe expand a little bit the comments that we had during this round. I would start again with Mrs. Niolu. Maybe she would like to say something more and also to reply to to Callum's reply, and then we will follow the same order of comments.
No, thank
Please,
you,
Professor.
because I use more than my time in the first speech, because I understood I had 10 minutes altogether. So I'm sorry, and I apologize for this. So I'm not adding anything. So I'm satisfied with Mr. Callum's answer. And I also link to what Mr. Paganini said about well-being, because it's really right. It's the right expression for using what we mean nowadays in our society, because mental health is being not having symptoms, not having illness, and it's also what Mr. Callum was saying before, being able. There are a lot of definition of what health is. From something starting from 1946 from World Health Organization, and which said mental health and mental health also is the absence of illness, but is also the capability of using all our properties, so cognition, memory, attention, empathy, and all of we have in our brain and in our body to do our best in our society. And this is what we mean by well-being, which is mental and also physical all together. I don't say anything more because there is much more about the link about mind and mind and body. No more differences, no more separations, and this is the trend now, and this is the trend we have to use to look at our new society, because many things are changing, many things are already changed, but we have to follow the well-being and the mental and body connection. Thank you.
Thank to you, Callum. Before you reply, maybe you want to go on with the discussion. Let me just read you this interesting question that we had. Maybe you can just go on with the discussion and follow up on what Mrs. Niolu said, and then also answer to this question. But first, let me read it. Let me share it with you. The question is, it's interesting that some disorders deflect criticism, for example, Greta's autism, while others, for example, narcissism, invite criticism. What makes a disorder forgivable or unforgivable? That is the question.
Well, actually, I'd take that first. It's a very interesting question. I think we need to make a distinction in society that we often fail to do I think it's important that there are some people's behavior that we can judge in a sort of legal sense and say, if you look at there's political actors, whoever you want to choose, who you think is a psychopath. Many people say someone like Trump, for instance, right? You can look at someone like Trump, regardless of your politics, and say you say he's a narcissist and he's doing harm, right? Sure, you can make that judgment given his political position, but ultimately I think we need to have, so we may not have sympathy for what he politically says, for instance, or some people might not, but we can still have empathy for the fact that clearly the foundation of it is something in him, some pain that maybe he doesn't see. I mean, I've always felt there's two types of people. There's people who blame themselves for problems, and there's people who always blame other people. And there's been interesting studies done that show that people who are actually tend to put the blame on themselves die younger on average than people who are very aggressive to others. And I think the aggression you see in some people is them taking pain and putting it onto other people to free themselves from it. And I think, though, it's important for us to make a distinction that every form of pathology deserves empathy and understanding. We need to understand the wellspring of it, but understanding is not the same thing as not liking the outcome. We can judge the behavior, but also we can not have sympathy for the behavior, like the result, but we can have empathy for the cause. And this is the same thing, that it's a classic liberal position that, I may not agree with what you say, but I defend your right to say it. It's the same principle that I may hate what you've said, but still have empathy that underlying it, you're a human being who perhaps said it because you're in pain, even if you deny that. And I think there's a need for us to have those two ideas. The second thing I quickly say, and I don't want to take up too much time, is actually responding to really interesting, the previous statement, which I thought was really interesting, and it links also to what Cinzia was just saying as well, about the mind-body dualism and the physical work. I thought it was a fascinating point about the fact we don't do as much physical labor. But what I would argue here, I think, to bring them together, is that in the past we had labor we had some people who did physical labor, so they were skilled in some way with their hands, some physical embodied labor. But we also had people who did emotional labor. The priest was not a philosopher per se. He was in the parish. He was dealing with the people. He was pastoral. And so there was emotional labor being done. And most of our lives, if you think about it, are emotional forms of labor. That it's about relationships. So you have people whose profession is to deal with physical things. There's people whose profession is to deal with emotional relationships. But I think what's happening today is that we have far more people doing neither of these things, but doing mental labor. So when I'm doing this here, I'm not doing any physical labor. I haven't broken a sweat throughout this conversation. But I also am not really doing emotional labor, because even though it's lovely to speak to you all, it's a very different experience being with a camera here than if we were in person. It's not an emotional labor in the same way. But we are doing mental labor. It's hard to think about. And I think it's quite right that this type of, in the past, people didn't do the same amount of mental labor. But I think what's interesting is that as human beings, the Cartesian idea is we have mind and body. I've always felt this is a very flawed way of thinking. I always think that we are tripartite. We have a body, we have thoughts, but we also have emotions. Essentially, we have physicality, we have mentality, and we have emotionality, relationality. It's about the connection. And I think that we are tripartite in that sense. I suppose the religious would say mind, body, and spirit, perhaps. And I'm not religious, I don't associate spirit, but I think the spirit is, think why we go to church. We may listen to the priest speaking from the pulpit, but ultimately we are there as what? We're there as congregants. Congregants means to congregate, to come together. And if you think about today, be it in the church or be it in a football stadium, it doesn't matter what the sport is that you're watching in a sports stadium. The reason it's exciting is you're together with people. It doesn't matter if it's football or tennis or ice hockey, you're together. And that is the thing, the reason why religions or sporting events capture our imaginations, is because it brings us together as a community. And I think that we need to understand human life as all three, the physical, the mental, but also the emotional. And I do think that what's happening in the digital world, it was brilliantly argued in the previous talk there and comment, was that we may be doing a lot of mental work now, but we are neglecting the physical, the importance of that. We've actually lowered its status, so that now if you are you're working in some physical way, it's seen as almost menial or low-paid labor. And also emotionally, we've completely forgotten the importance of that. And this is the real danger, I think, going forward after the pandemic particularly, that we are neglecting and forgetting the importance of the emotional. But I think it is quite right, also the physical. There's more to us than just our philosophy. There are many other things in human life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Callum, for the points that you raised. And let's conclude with Pietro. I have a question for you, but unfortunately, I have to ask you to be brief because we are running out of time. Question from Scott, who says, Pietro makes a good point that a lot depends on how we use technology. Question is it simply up to us as individuals to secure our own mental well-being?
First of all, you know that for important discussion, you cannot have short-term discussion. We were mentioning the Agora and the Greeks, and they had a lot of time. So
right.
This is another matter. I put myself in this because we always do smart things, short. We should have long things where we basically end to nothing. It's just a discussion. It's just knowledge, and it helps us. So sometimes we have to say, okay, today we take a full day of discussion. It leads to nothing. We are very not productive. I'm talking as a liberal free market supporter. We should be not productive at all, but discuss. Okay, we should do this game. I want to do a second game, since I didn't know about what Colin mentioned, the studies of blaming somebody else. So I usually blame myself. This time I will start blaming. So if this webinar sucks, it's because of Professor Niolu, and it's because of Colin, not because of myself. So let's see if I can live longer, at least. Yes, when we talk, let me first go to the question. When we talk to technology, is really about us. It's really about how we are critically educated and how we can critically approach technology and use technology. Colin earlier made a very great example, is when we are sitting with our kids, and I have a son who's 10. We tend to spend our time not talking to them, but spending our life inside the technology. So we probably, or you just go to a bar today, we say, we in England or in Italy, we can go back to bars. But if you go to bars, down here in Giacomo is a few doors from here. So let's go down, and you see that people are together in bars, but they are not talking to each other. They're on their devices. So it really depends on us. It really depends on also the level of attention. And here you see this discussion is bringing us everywhere, because it depends also on the level of attention. When you study communication, you say first rule of communication 10 years ago, not 100 years ago, 10 years ago, is level of attention of people is 20 minutes. So you should talk for 20 minutes. So I can talk today for 20 minutes now. So be ready. But 20 minutes. Today, they tell you on Facebook that the level of attention is less than 10 seconds. So we went from 20 minutes to 10 seconds. So you should have a speech of 10 seconds. You see, this is another important element. Why is our level of attention 10 seconds? It's because our brain is captured by many things happening around us. Before, we only had books, maybe, or our Socrates talking to us. Today, you have millions of things right now. I have my phone here. When Colin was giving his keynote speech, I made an exercise, try not to be captured by my phone. But my phone started blinking, and at a certain point, I swear, Colin, I did the best to follow you, but for a moment, I took my phone and checked my phone, okay? And that is something that has to do with our brain. And again, 100 years ago, there was not so much overload of information. The first rule when you send a message is how you capture the attention of people. So when we think about technology, there we are. It's just upon us. And perhaps we're overreacting to this, because we are not used to technology. Maybe in 50 years, in 100 years, in 200 years, we're, of course, no longer here. But we simply will figure out, if we can, move forward in time, that humanity has survived. It simply has evolved differently than we expect this to happen. So as liberals, we should ask these questions to ourselves, but then we should also let things happen as long as individuals are able to play their liberties and respect, subjective and objective liberties. Maybe in 200 years, we look at that and say, oh, wow, that was fine. Think about 500 years, probably people were not thinking about a human being. There's a bunch of books, a bunch of text from Greek tradition, where people in Athens were complaining that earlier in time, was much better than the time they were living. So Let's see what happens. But what is interesting in this discussion, and again, I need to conclude now. I want to tell is leading nowhere. If we have to put down notes of this conversation, we have a lot of great things, great key points, talking points, but it's leading nowhere. But it's leading nowhere because there is nowhere to go right now, and it's a very incredible discussion because it involves psychology, psychiatric, sociology, anthropology. It involves everything because it's about the evolution of human beings. And is it fair to have this discussion? Yes, probably. Should we expect answers? I would say no, we shouldn't expect answers. I look at my students and I think, oh my God, what is happening with them? But then I'm thinking probably my teachers were saying the same thing about me. The difference is that the gap between me and my teacher and me and my students is much wider because there is this device here, and there is the internet, and there is the digitalization of human beings, basically, that is a dramatic, I would say, revolution. So to end, I don't know where we're going. As long as we promote our liberties, I think we're going in the right direction.
Thank you, Pietro. Actually, let me just say that I'm sure that this live webinar didn't suck, and I would also say that you did an amazing. You all did an amazing jobs providing excellent and remarkable angles and information, and you help our audience, to understand maybe some complicated issues and problems, and you give a lot of information, especially to people like me, who I'm not a real expert of such topics. So finally, I would like to thank you very much for joining us. I would like to thank the speakers for the excellent points that they raised, for the fantastic discussion, tremendous, and also I think it's very useful for everyone to hear what you said today at this roundtable. And thank to the audience, thank to that made very interesting questions that we share with our panelists. I will also remind you that the webinar will be re-uploaded on our official channels, and also I would remind you the next free market roadshow events which will take place on May 25, 5 p.m. CEST at Thessaloniki, and will be hosted by the Marketing Club, the Greek think tank. The keynote will be by Jürgen Warborn on IP, brand protection, and patents, the foundation of innovation. I thank again our guests, our speakers, and the audience, and see you next time.